I'm Shauna Fleischbein with Castle Group, and I will be moderating. I'll be taking all the questions and passing them along here to our panelists. And I'm joined by my colleague Laura Bryant from Castle, and then Chelsea Morris of ATI Disaster Recovery Services, and Joe Thompson from Gulf Shore Insurance. So welcome everybody, and I'll pass it around and let everybody formally introduce themselves.
Thanks, Shauna. Hey again, I'm Laura Bryant. I'm the Business Development Manager here for Castle Group in Southwest Florida, and joining our team today as we talk about hurricane preparedness. So Chelsea, I'd like you to introduce ATI, and then we'll move on to Joe.
Everyone, I am Chelsea Morris. I'm the Business Development Manager for ATI Restoration here out of our Tampa office. We are a full service disaster recovery services company, providing full service mitigation, environmental services, and reconstruction as well. Joe?
Thank you, Chelsea. Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Thompson. I'm a client advisor and partner with Gulf Shore Insurance. We specialize in community associations. We've been in business for about 50 years, multiple offices on the West Coast, one on the East Coast as well. And we're now part of Acrisure, which is one of the largest brokers in the world.
Thank you, guys. All right, so hurricane preparedness and having a hurricane plan. So the most important thing is to be prepared for any type of emergency. I know here at Castle Group, and hopefully all the other condos and HOAs out there, you have a hurricane plan. In that hurricane plan, to prepare you for season, you're going to have a hurricane checklist that has your inventory of all of your assets. Maybe it's your pool, lawn chairs, your umbrellas, anything that you need that would be a projectile when we know a storm is coming. So you would have a checklist of that, and you would have a plan as to where things are going to be stored. And oh, somebody's email. Sorry. So in that hurricane preparedness folder, so at Castle we have our evacuation plan, a checklist as far as what supplies owners would need and the HOA would need. Unit owner rosters, that's another important thing that you want to make sure you have. Your insurance plan. So at Castle, we're big about binders, and we actually have a binder for our insurance policies that we print. So not only do we have them digitally, but we have them bound in a binder so that when we're leaving the site, we're leaving with our hurricane binder and our insurance policy binder so that we are aware of what that says. And in our hurricane binder, we have our unit owner roster, so we know who's there. And we're aware of, we print that unit owner roster within 24 hours of that storm coming. And that's so we know who's in the building and who's not. Other things in preparation, if you want, we had a couple questions come in about, where do we go for information? Not only should your association have the hurricane plan published, hopefully in April, May, they're sending that information out and then reiterating it and resending it when we know storms are named and out there in the Gulf. But also you can go to Red Cross. I've got a link on one of the last slides where you can go to, you obviously want to go to your local county websites. And then there's the, NOAA.gov, NOAA.gov, yep. So that's another good website to go to as far as giving you a list of supplies you would need as a homeowner or condo owner. But I could go on for a whole list. If you need a sample of what a hurricane preparedness plan should look like, please feel free to reach out to us here at Castle Group, and we can help you with that.
Yeah. And another tip.
Questions?
I was going to say, Laura, another tip, as Laura and I are both, have both been CAMs, both licensed CAMs ourselves, and we've all probably run into this, is don't just plan of where you're going to store things like your pool furniture and any outdoor things. Actually do a dry run. Have your maintenance staff or whoever's in charge of that do a dry run of where you're going, like actually take it off the deck or wherever you're pulling stuff from and put it away, because you'd be surprised how many times you find that you have this grand idea to store things somewhere and then it doesn't fit. And then you're scrambling last minute to figure out where to put things. And a lot of people are throwing things in pools and whatever you might come up with to find places to store things. So just word to the wise, actually do a dry run of those tasks.
Yep.
I can add something real quick to that. And I always recommend that boards consider, I mean, these plans are great. There's a lot of boilerplate plans out there, but to have some type of a committee, whether it's a disaster preparedness committee or some other committee with a different name, to meet at least quarterly to sort of revisit this plan, to do what Shauna said, to do a dry run, and maybe even have your insurance agent and somebody like Chelsea from a disaster restoration company sit kind of second chair to that committee and be part of that committee on a routine basis is really important, because that way you can actually have a conversation and sort of create some liveliness to this plan, as opposed to just getting the plan, putting it on the manager's shelf and it just collects dust for 12 months. That's not going to do anybody any good at all. So actually going through the motions and talking about it in a formal way is really the best course of action with these emergency plans.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And going back to the insurance side, Joe, I know you and I, when we worked together before on site, you find things that if you've added things over that year, so going back to Joe's point, so let's say you added something at your amenity or added some umbrellas or playground or some type of asset of the community, that's when you're reviewing those insurance policies to make sure that it is an insurable item that you would want to replace in a storm. So that, going back to having a panel of people, that it's good to review those to make sure you're insuring everything. I know gates and fencing can sometimes get left off because people forget that they added it, right?
You're absolutely right.
So having a panel like that is a great suggestion. Entering into agreements with landscapers or a company just like ATI for moisture mitigation, water mitigation issues. So you have a vendor that's at your fingertips to come in and work with you, and you know that pricing up front. So that's another part of that contract. You know kind of exactly what we're going to get into, and you have an idea of what is this going to cost, at least to get us to a certain point. If you're a condo, keep your generator full, as much as you can during the months through June through November. If for some reason, we've had a storm, you've lost power for some reason, but you're down, 20% in your tank, get it capped off. Unfortunately, gas is expensive right now, but you definitely want to do it. And then keep cash on hand in case you need gas or anything else and banks are closed or power's down.
Yeah,
anything else, you guys?
I was just going to add, we'll get into this, and Chelsea will talk a little bit more about the importance, especially from a disaster recovery standpoint. But disaster recovery, restoration, your landscape, like Laura said, your gas, those are all important vendors to have agreements with prior to, because that means you're going to be on the top of the list when a storm does come, if a storm does come, let's say, rather than scrambling and calling these places along with, every other association in the area, trying to figure out how do we get these down trees out of the roadways? How do we, we're out of power, our propane wasn't, we're running out, all of these. That's why it's important to have these agreements in place prior. So you're at the top of the list and you're going to get those services. And then one other thing I would throw in there too is communication. So we're talking about these plans, we're talking about all this, but it needs to be communicated to to your residents so they know what to expect, especially in condominium associations. They know if you're going to open gates or have elevators down or lock doors, close off amenities. You want to communicate all of this really prior to June 1st, especially if you have a high seasonality in your building. If you know as a manager, as a board, that majority of your residents leave, let's say May 1st, mid-May, you want to communicate to them and remind them of procedures and whatnot prior to them leaving. So they need to be reminded, you need to make sure your unit's secured, or you have a local person, the local contact who can secure your unit in the case that a storm's coming before they leave. Because if they've left, and you're communicating to them mid-June and they're gone and they don't have a local person, then they're like, well, what do I do now? So.
Yep, absolutely. All right, and again, we'll get into more detail as we go through the slides. All right, Chelsea, do you want to speak on this?
Sure. Yeah, so this is basically just an example of what we use as pretty much a checklist that we run through whenever we do have a pre-established emergency response agreement with some of our clients. And so it just gives you a high level.
I think we lost Chelsea for a second.
We did.
Well, while we wait for her to come back, we had a question come in. So what are the best practices on how board members can work? Oh, you back, Chelsea?
Chelsea's back. We lost you, Chelsea.
Am I back?
Yeah. So going back, you said it was a high level overview. Oh,
I think we lost her. Okay, we'll go to the
that's a great frozen shot.
Yeah, that could have been a lot worse. Do we have you, Chelsea? You keep freezing. Are you there now?
I hope so.
Oh,
we lost
all
her
right,
again.
let's go to that question.
Let's go to the question. So what are the best practices on how board members can work with the with local
Sorry
cert?
about that.
We're just going over a question right now, Chelsea. So how can the board work with the local CERT team within their community? So Joe, Laura, anybody want to touch on that?
Yeah, I can start. So again, I would go back to with your working with your local CERT team, it's being organized and it's staying organized on a regular basis. Like Joe was saying, meeting regularly, seeing what's changed within the association. Did we add an entry or exit point? Did we add landscaping that, did we add a structure, anything? And then, there's.
I would add the volunteer aspect of that as well. Make sure they're properly covered. If you have a committee that's participating, sanctioned by the board, to make sure that the volunteers that are part of that are actually covered. And that also goes with any disaster preparedness committee or any committee for that matter. If someone's going to be actively walking on the site, checking on things, going through check boxes prior to people leaving, making sure that they're putting things away, it's coming off of the balconies, property in the open is secured. All of that comes with hazards physically for people if they were to get hurt. So just double check that volunteers are properly covered. And some carriers are different in the language in terms of how they provide the coverage. It has to be through a co-appointment by an active board member. Other carriers provide broader coverage for volunteers. So just be aware of that when you have a lot of folks participating, which is great. That's what we want, but just make sure they're adequately protected. And Chelsea's back. It looks like she's alive and well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you now.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And I'll add one more thing to the local CERT before we let Chelsea get back to her contingency plan here. I know at Castle, we really encourage our managers, our staff, especially in towers, in condominiums, to just know your local emergency providers in general. Get to know the police chief, the fire chief, all of those people, and have relationships. Have the manager have relationships with all of them. So, when things do happen, whether it's a hurricane or not, you kind of already have some relationships in place there. So that's something that we always encourage, our staff and our managers to do for their local areas as well. So go ahead, Chelsea, you want to take over here with your contingency plan?
Sure, yes. Try this again. So basically, this is just a high-level overview of, what should be included in your emergency response plan, as far as your property checklist, the key contacts that have already been mentioned, what roles they're playing, and all of that information. So just to give you an example of, what you should be included in that plan, as well as what Castle recommends for you. On top of that,
and I think
go to the next one. So the first piece of this, this is basically just the property checklist. You are going to identify all of the companies that hold your utilities, your account number, their contact information, and the most important piece is where the shutoffs are. When a hurricane rolls through and you're scrambling to find the water shut off, it just does not work out well. We've actually, during the polar vortex that just happened, we had clients calling us to come out and shut off their water because they didn't know where it was located. So that's something that's not only beneficial for you in the event of a disaster, but for your restoration partner that you're using, you know, if they have to go out and respond and no one's there to meet them at the property, you know, after a hurricane, it's not always easy to get back in, especially if you're on, you know, a barrier island that was evacuated, something like that. It's beneficial for us to know where it's at as well, so we can kind of identify and just go directly to it and shut it off as well. And then
I like that you add pictures in this.
Yep, just the basic property overview. I mean, the address, that's the main thing. Year bill, if there's any renovations, and floor plans. The floor plans, the property layout, all of that, you know, that can also help with, you need to have an evacuation plan, not only for hurricanes, but any sort of disaster situation. That is also very helpful for us as a partner, any partner that you work with, whether it's a plumber, you know, an electrician, anything like that. Because if, say, a property had 10 different buildings and we need to respond to building 6, that eliminates us driving through the property for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, trying to find building 6 when we can just look at the property layout and know exactly where to go immediately.
Great. And Chelsea, you made a good point when you're talking about evacuation. Something else that sometimes gets forgotten about is getting back after. If you live in a place like Clearwater Beach, Longboat Key, Siesta Key, you know, any places where you're on, you know, kind of an island or a peninsula or anything of that nature, you need to remember that there's sometimes passes and things that you need to get back on to, you know, your area there. And that's something I know that we ensure that we communicate that to our residents prior, so they know, because, you know, I think we got a question for somebody who's like a new to Florida. So somebody who's never lived, you know, in an evacuation zone or anything, they may be completely clueless and have no idea. So be sure that you're communicating that to your residents, and that you have all of those checks and balances in place as well.
Hey, Sean, and something that you said earlier about the different counties and knowing the details about evacuation. So I know at least with 4 different counties, the emergency manager of each county will actually come out routinely and do a presentation for residents. It happens all the time. I know they get backlogs, so you have to get a request in, but that's part of their job, to come out and do public outreach. So if you can't get them to come specifically to your association, if you're real small, they typically do seminars this time of the year to kind of go over all of that specific information to your region. So I know I've seen, you know, these presentations in Collier, Lee, I've seen it in Sarasota, Manatee County, and I've met all the emergency managers of every one of those counties, and I'm sure Tampa does the same thing. So it is really important to try to get them to come out and get that information, especially if you're new, and especially for a property management, you know, company or manager, if they don't have a management company. That way the information gets disseminated and they don't have to worry about aggregating it themselves. They can just have it right from the source and present it to the community.
Yeah, great point, Joe.
Yep. All right.
Yeah, and then so the second piece, which Shauna and Laura both already touched on, you know, is just identifying contact information for your residents, the board members, but also you want to include, you know, local emergency contacts. You want to include the maintenance team if there is one, community manager, your insurance agent, and also your carriers, along with your vendor partners as well. So you'll see on that last page on external stakeholders, it has all of the vendor partners that you would be working with and their after hours phone number. If you do have an account number with them, that can also be included on there, and just their contact information during regular business hours as well.
Yep. So, and if you are currently a Castle community, so this is in our hurricane binder and our contract renewal schedule. So we have all of this information. We pull the contract renewal schedule, any contracts we have on file, and again, these are all part of our binders, and we pull those off-site with us if we have to leave. So we do have copies of them, and we know who to contact in case we don't have computers available or power where we're at. But all good information to have, and it's good to know what's in your contract and what's not.
And guys, this is important to have. Hurricane season aside, year round, for any emergency or any issue, having all this information in one place is great. God forbid, you know, your manager has an accident or something, especially, you know, like say a self-managed community, and, you know, a lot of that's in their brain. You want to make sure that you have that somewhere for anything that could come up, even outside of hurricane season.
Yep. All right, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Again, engaging with your contractors. You know, it's, you know, Joe, I mean, I don't know how much fraud you saw with the roof business after Irma, right?
Yeah, considerable amount. I mean, and again, I know Chelsea, I don't want to take too much of her thunder on this, but I mean, she's probably going to talk about the sort of pre-negotiated priority type contracts with vendors, which is a really good idea for boards to get to know, you know, develop a relationship with reputable vendors that they're going to need after the storm. Because what happens invariably after every storm, all of a sudden we have 25 roofing contractors in the area. We have 10 different disaster remediation companies that nobody even has heard of prior to the storm are now all of a sudden basically driving around your neighborhood. Who knows what type of insurance they have, if they have any insurance, if they have a contractor's license, if they have any of the specific, you know, licenses that they need to do the mold remediation or whatever they're doing. We just don't know the details of it. And who knows if they're going to be there after the claim. We don't know if they're going to be around. Maybe they'll go back to the Panhandle or go back to Kansas or wherever they're from, but they're just chasing dollar signs at that point. So if you have these relationships prior, then you should be in a really good position. And I'm sure Chelsea will get into more details, but you want to really vet who you're kind of partnering with to make sure that they will have the resources to respond to you after the event. Because in Irma, we also saw a lot of players that were local, regional players that got overextended. So they had kind of pre-promised so many people, hey, we're going to be there after the storm. And then guess what? They weren't. So that's the other thing where you really need to drill down, and you can do that in conjunction with having your manager interview these different vendors and really asking tough questions to get to the bottom of whether or not they're going to actually live up to that type of an agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Chelsea, you're going to touch on that a little bit later in the presentation on what to ask, right, when you're talking to vendors.
Yes. Yeah. And I think Joe touched on a really good point right there, is that a lot of restoration companies, they overextend themselves, whether, you know, they don't have enough resources in their local office and they're not able to bring in additional resources. So they can't assist all of their clients that they made promises to be there for basically throughout hurricane season. So my recommendation is always have a backup plan, have multiple relationships. You know, there's, after a catastrophe, I mean, there's a lot of work to go around for every single restoration company out there, and just having a backup plan and knowing not only, of course, for this article that's posted here, knowing who will be your first call, but who will be your second call if your first call is not able to deliver. So.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's a good point. Well, this is what we're all about in property management, is being proactive versus reactive. So that's the key to good management, right, of anything. So on that note, I'll let you go through your portion of this slide, Chelsea, and then I'll add to some.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, basically a restoration company, you want someone that, you know, can walk and assess your property with you, so that if there are any vulnerabilities or anything that you need to basically repair before hurricane season, so that you're not left with additional damage that could have been prevented in the first place, they'll be able to point that out to you. And that's kind of what we would do with that property checklist when we walk through the property with our clients, just pointing everything out and identifying where everything is located. And also goes back to what Joe said earlier, you know, we can partner with you to help create and maintain, make sure it's updated, your plan for contingencies before a disaster actually occurs. And then also just increasing the speed and efficiency of recovery efforts. If you know who that first call is going to be, and you have that relationship already established with someone, you're going to be their number one priority. They are going to respond to your property before they're going to respond to someone that just called them, you know, randomly out of nowhere, because they already have that commitment to you. And then just creating peace of mind. It's a very stressful situation after a hurricane hits. I mean, I think even before, we've all been to the grocery store a couple of days before a storm comes through, and we can see the chaos from that. So just imagine, I mean, that's before a storm. So after, it's just, all rules go out the window, and just make sure, that you have your partners lined up and who you're going to call, to really, create peace of mind, not only for you, but for your residents and for everyone in your community.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Chelsea, with the chaos that comes prior to. I'm a native of Florida, rare born and bred native of Florida, of South Florida, of all places. So, I've seen my fair share of storms and all of this. And, usually until it's about a category 3 or 4 is when I start getting nervous. Up until then, I'm like, okay, well, we can survive this. But as we all know, Florida is a huge hotspot. We have tons of people moving to Florida right now and have moved to Florida over this past year. So some of that chaos is probably going to get worse here over the next couple of years, because we're going to have a lot of people here who have never gone through these storms before and don't know how to prepare. So they're going to be looking for a lot of guidance, from especially those who live in condominium associations, homeowners associations. They're going to need that guidance because they've never lived through this before, and it can be quite overwhelming for those who haven't.
Yep. So being proactive. So producing a hurricane newsletter prior to, in April, send out a newsletter so everybody asks questions, your hurricane plan, and then doing town halls. Sometimes we'll do town halls with a presentation, and just like Joe said, you bring in the local authorities to educate the community on what to do during the storm. And the more people know in preparation for an emergency, like you said, the less stress you're going to have, right? Because you're going to know what to expect to a degree. Not like with Irma, we didn't know what to expect.
I don't think boards should hesitate either to, request that their insurance agent, comes in as well, whether it's through, a town hall like seminar or something, to answer questions for board members, for residents. I mean, because a lot of agents that are specializing in condominium associations or community associations, they should have a division or resource for personal lines as well, whether it's through their own agency or through someone else, and they can come and sort of bridge the gap for folks to understand, well, who will be responsible for what from a coverage and insurance standpoint when there is a claim, especially if you're in the condo association context, because there's a lot of gray areas for some people when they're not well versed in it and they don't live it day after day. So I think it's always good to ask those tough questions ahead of time. That way the board knows what to expect as it relates to deductibles and coverage and things that are all going to affect the outcome of the storm after the fact.
Yeah, Joe, we actually had a question come in, and I don't think it's just insurance related. It's an overall, a question of what is a condominiums, and we'll even stretch that to what's an association, because I'm sure we have some HOAs on here too. What's the association's responsibility when it comes to storms, or let's just talk disasters in general?
So, I mean, it depends on the context. I mean, if we're talking, condo association, the statute is pretty explicit on who's responsible for what. It specifically excludes items that the master policy does not cover. So essentially the interior of the unit, so your drywall in, is the association's responsibility from a very simple description, and anything thereafter like wall coverings, window coverings, floor coverings, appliances, built-ins, anything that is contents within the unit itself is going to be the owner's responsibility. So that's essentially how it works in a condo. HOA, a lot different. You have separate single family homes and the individual owners there insuring those through a homeowner's insurance policy. However, there's a lot of common elements throughout the property that the HOA is responsible for. And Laura had mentioned earlier, a lot of times the HOAs will get these appraisals, and sometimes if it's a newer community, they'll turn over and they'll have this old appraisal that the developer commissioned or something, and they'll just use that for years, and they'll be missing a lot of critical items that aren't covered. Things like maybe there's some lake pumps, there's lift stations, there's random property all over the, it could be a very large association, and you want to make sure those are covered. I mean, things as simple as the little structure that surrounds the dumpsters with the little, opening gates there. I remember a situation with Irma where that wasn't on a schedule for an association. They had that entire compound there was damaged beyond repair there after Irma. So there was no coverage. So making sure that those items are properly covered is key, and really evaluating those appraisals and doing sort of a site walkthrough to make sure that all the property is on the appraisal, and then it gets transposed to a schedule of values through your insurance agent and then given to the insurance carrier to make sure that it's covered separately. And then of course, you can get into another discussion on deductibles and how that would all be covered and applied as it relates to, is it per item, the deductible application, or is it in aggregate, right? So that's a huge, huge difference. And since we are in a hard property market, we're seeing a lot of carriers give folks sort of less desirable, less favorable deductible terms. So you might have a situation in the future where, say we have a bad storm season this year, you may have a deductible structure that is less favorable than you had last year. Make sure you fully understand it. Because a lot of folks, we had the calendar year annual aggregate deductible. Now we're getting a lot of named storm per occurrence deductible, totally different animal than the prior. So really understanding those coverages and how they'll apply when there's an event is critical for understanding what your self-insured retention is and what you're responsible for as an association, whether it's an HOA or a condo association.
Great.
Well, yeah, especially with a condo association, if a homeowner's not aware of what the association is truly insured for, and it ultimately affects everyone in that tower, right? It's important that you do know what your associations, even if, if you don't want to be a part of the association business, you probably for sure want to know what your association insurances and coverages for your association that affects your roof, your, windows, rails, etc. Correct, Joe?
Or just knowing what your part of,
Right.
the self-insurance is going to be, because how are they going to fund it? The funding mechanism behind, the under deductible costs is important. So a lot of folks now, we're in a harder market, they're increasing their deductible and they're not thinking about what that means going forward. So you might've been to 2% deductible last year. Say you're in a large tower. Well, that's 2% of the total insurable value. Let's say now that the rates went up and you said, my God, we need to increase to a 5% deductible. And oh, by the way, our appraisal went up this year as well. Well, now your deductible, under deductible costs are way greater than they were before, at 2% at a lesser value. Now you're at 5% of the value of the tower that has now gone up in value. So if that's going to be a special assessment, how are you going to pay for that? Is it going to be through your loss assessment coverage on your HO6 policy? Some folks aren't even aware of what that even really means. So the state requires that you get at least $2,000 of loss assessment coverage. There's some carriers that can make that much higher, as high as $10,000. We've seen some provide as high as $25,000. So to some extent, you can partially fund the deductible through loss assessment if owners are educated and they're willing to purchase the extra coverage. But a lot of other associations are obviously doing it through potential reserves and then lines of credit as well. And getting that situated on the front end with banks is so important right now, because obviously we're going into a situation where folks are increasing their deductibles, and the ability for these storms to create more situations where you're not going to actually trigger coverage is greater when you go into that type of a situation. So it's going to be an interesting storm season. I hope nothing happens, but it's now is the time to start thinking about this. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, and I like your point of the line of credit. And I'm sure Chelsea, wants to know how they're going to be paid if they're coming in doing remediation work, if insurance is going to cover, or they're going to have to hit their deductible first. So look at your financials. Make sure you either have money set aside in your reserves, or there's a line item on your budget, or you have a line of credit and you have a relationship with a banker.
And I think, just knowing what the association is responsible for and what the unit owners are responsible for from our perspective is very helpful in, making sure that the actual billing process, we're including the right items on each prospective, invoice that goes out. So just having that knowledge up front and sharing it with your restoration partner is very, very helpful.
So I think we kind of touched on that. I think our next slides are going into, so we had a storm, it happened, now what?
Yeah, so this,
flip us through, Laura?
Was it next? You said next.
Yeah. You wanna, oh, did we miss one? I may have missed one, sorry.
This one? No.
there we go.
Do you want to go ahead and talk on the restoration partner, or did we already cover that?
Yeah, I mean, we covered some of the items, but just to run through it. So this
Oh
is
yeah, here's your
still
questions. These were the questions that you said that were going to be important. Here we go.
Yeah, so this will go into your pre-planning process and just making sure that you do have the right partner lined up to assist you in the event of a disaster. So you really want to find out, how long has the company been in business? I mean, you would probably prefer to get someone who's been in business for 20 plus years instead of someone who just started up prior to hurricane season because they saw the money coming from it or something like that. So just make sure that they have the experience and pretty much it. And then just finding out how big they are. So whether they have a local office or if they have offices across the country that they're able to pull in extra labor to come in and assist all of their local clients and just making sure that they have enough resources to go around to everyone because like I mentioned earlier, a lot of restoration contractors do get overextended during a hurricane or any kind of catastrophic event. And then just finding out, how wide is its network of local subcontractors. A lot of the reconstruction efforts, that is done by subcontractors. Any kind of plumbing, repairing of pipes, that all needs to be done before a restoration company can come in and start drying out, extracting water. So just make sure that they have the right people that they're working with to assist you.
Yeah.
And then
Make sure that they're insured and licensed properly.
Yes.
yes,
They're a subcontractor. And then that insurance policy, and if Joe can speak further on that, especially with subcontractors. There's specific language, and I may be forgetting, but if you've got a subcontractor coming into your association, what do we need to be looking for specifically, insurance-wise, to make sure that the association's covered?
So on the front end, again, this gets back to developing those relationships, interviewing these companies prior to the storm coming before. Don't start the interviews when we're in the cone of probability. That's not a good idea. So if you do this beforehand and you review the insurance and number one, find out that they are reputable, they're large, work with your insurance agent. Typically, something that we use is an independent contractor agreement. And it spells out what limits of insurance are necessary, basically industry standard. So if you're getting a certificate of insurance from Chelsea, you can sort of correlate that to the independent contract agreement and say, okay, well, they have a $2 million general aggregate of general liability coverage. They have $1 million of bodily injury for auto, umbrella, et cetera, et cetera. So ensuring that all that is in place and sufficient is the first step. Second thing is making sure that the association is named an additional insured. So if something happens and the company creates a situation that results in bodily injury or extreme property damage to the association, you want their insurance to respond first. You want the vendor's insurance to be primary and non-contributory to your insurance as the association. So your insurance is there, but it's excess to the primary insurance of the vendor. None of this will ever happen unless you have a contract that stipulates they provide you with those things. So if you don't, and you just sign their contract, it's not going to help you one bit at all. So that's something that you really want to talk to your insurance agent about in detail to make sure that these companies are reputable, they have the right coverages, but more importantly, you're protected as an association and the right coverages will trigger and respond to your benefit if something goes awry after the storm with some type of major claim. And then also to Chelsea's points, these bullets are good. You could correlate this to really your insurance agent as well. Make sure you're vetting your insurance agent. Are you specializing with somebody that works only with community associations? Do they have multiple locations? Have they been through a hurricane? Do they have a claims team? Do they have more than just one location? So, I mean, all those things are important because if the storm is big enough and it affects a big enough region and you're working with an agent that is, a mom and pop operation or a small office somewhere, they're not going to have any power, just like everybody else. How are they going to file your claim? So you really want to ask those questions of everybody and don't just assume that things are just the wheels are going to be in motion after the storm. You have to think and look out for yourself and for the interests of the association when you're weighing all this.
Yeah, that's a great point because the same goes for management. We pull from our offices, our employees who are in different parts of the state when a certain part of the state gets hit. So, when Daytona got hit a few years ago, it was all of us from Tampa in different areas that were going and helping, the properties in Daytona to get back on their feet and all hands on deck. So, great points, with any vendor that's going to need to provide, those hands-on services like that. So we'll let Chelsea get back here. So what services they can provide, right? Is that where we left off?
Yes. Yeah. So, well, actually the office presence. So find out where their closest office is, because that is also going to affect your response time as well. And then services. This is a big part because you want to find someone that is full service. They're not only doing, just the mitigation, but they're also doing full reconstruction as well. Or else they're gonna come in, do a dry out, water extraction, all of that. But then if they demo, you're just going to be left with a big hole in your drywall because they demoed, but they can't do reconstruction. So make sure that they are full service. And then, going back to the contracts, establishing that agreement. How is the pricing structured? Are they doing time and materials? Are they using, Xactimate, which I'll get into on the next slide, but just they should be able to provide pricing for you before you sign a contract, and that all kind of factors into that agreement that you established with them, whether you choose to go with the time and materials pricing or you choose to go another route. And then tools and resources. So this kind of goes in with what Shauna was saying, if they have to pull other resources from other offices like they did in Daytona, which is what we did, during the polar vortex, where we have offices in Dallas and Houston, we sent people from all across the country to be able to go and respond to all of our clients there. So just make sure that they have enough resources that they can, actually respond and, like I said, do not overextend themselves. And then the licensing, certifications, training, you want to find someone that does have the IICRC certification, which is it's a restoration certification, and they are trained to perform all of these services, the water extraction, the fire, smoke, all of that. So you want to make sure that they are licensed, the mold remediation, general contractor, whatever it may be, and just make sure that they have all that available and that they can provide it to you as well. And then going back to the certificate of insurance, not only applies to the restoration company, but are they vetting their subcontractors? Are they requiring COIs from all of their subcontractors as well? And then the latest insurance estimating software, which is what I mentioned earlier, Xactimate. It's an industry standard. A lot of larger restoration companies do use it, especially if they work directly with insurance companies. And then problems or issues. I mean, we're not perfect. There's occasionally going to be a problem that we may encounter, but the most important part is, how do you fix it? What are you doing? If they cut corners making a repair, is there any warranty behind it? How are they going to come back out and fix it correctly? Just ask all of those questions.
Absolutely. So can you tell us where these are?
Yeah, so these were actually up in Pensacola and Orange Beach area after Hurricane Sally last year. A few of these were actually on the barrier island, so they were impacted pretty heavily. As you can see in the bottom right, the roof was missing off that one. And the thing to point out about this is this storm, 6 hours, 8 hours before it made landfall, was supposed to hit in New Orleans and in Mobile and all of that. And then it just shifted, within a few hours to hit Pensacola. So these people weren't as prepared as what they could have been. But whenever you are proactive in your planning efforts, you're always prepared. You know what to do.
But things can change in a turn of a dime with hurricanes. So absolutely. Here. All right, so what's next? We've gotten a storm and it's hit, and what do we do after the storm? So from the management side, you're going to regroup, make sure everybody's safe on your team. You're going to take poll of how many residents are still, if you're in a condo, who's there. again, in your hurricane preparedness plan, if you had a plan of, people to meet in a certain location or do something, again, just like any emergency, you would have that. You would perform your property inspection in detail and take pictures of everything. This will be for your remediation team and your insurance agent for sure. So from the property manager's perspective, we're taking pictures of all damages and making note of everything that we see. If you are in a condo and if your documents allow you to have access to the unit owners, you can go in and take pictures. If not, as an owner, you're going to want to be taking pictures for your insurance policy as well. And then communicate. So from our side, we'll be communicating with residents on where we're at with updates, where we're at with power, water, resources, when the tower or condo would be opening, or the HOA, if there's debris on the roadways. Our goal is to be on site within 4 hours after the emergency services have let us know that you can be on the roads, it's safe. And as long as we can get there, we get there. But this is when you're using those contracts that you've already agreed to, like your landscape vendor, and having the trees removed from the entry roadways. You're calling your insurance agent and say, you're not going to like to hear this, but 90% of our building's gone. Anything else you can think of, Shauna?
Just going back to, Chelsea, and we've touched on earlier, having that contact info. Who's going to be your line of contact? Not just your vendors, but even from a management standpoint, especially for those who are self-managed or, might be a part of a portfolio management team. So, we always have kind of a line, like, what if your manager has their own house, home that's been completely damaged, or they're stuck, and there's roadways blocked and they can't get there. You need to kind of have that succession, of who you're going to contact, who's point of contact number 2, who's point of contact number 3, because that's important, because some people might not, be able to get there that you had planned on being there. So keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, and after a disaster, have a backup plan, because you're not always, there's going to be power lines down and phone lines down. You're not going to be able to, you may not be able to call, all of your restoration companies, your other vendor partners, your residents, any of that. So have a backup plan on how you're going to reach people and get through to someone when, there's no phone service in the area and no power. So it's always good. Always have plan B, C, just as Shauna was saying.
Anything you can add, Joey? Yes?
No, the communication issue, we saw it after Irma. There was basically no cell service for 2 days, 3 days in some areas. There was a number of cell towers that were damaged. So how do you communicate? Basically, it's a satellite phone. That's something to consider as an investment, where you can communicate with the key people and personnel that you need to have communication with, because with no power, no cell phones, no landlines, there's no way to get with people other than trying to drive physically to see them, which is a very difficult thing to do after the storm. Most of the time you're not allowed on the roadways, or they advise that you shouldn't be, because there's so much debris, live power lines, et cetera. So really prepare for the worst. These storms are not something to mess around with. We know in Florida, for those of us that have been through a number of them, we're kind of like over it, and feel like we've seen it all, but I feel like with each one, it gets worse and worse. And again, I think earlier, either Laura or Shauna said, more people have moved here that are just clueless. You think 2017 was Irma, but since then, we had Michael, I think it was 2018, but that was the Panhandle, devastating Category 5. But since then, there really hasn't been any that have affected, middle to South Florida. And we've had hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people move here since then. And it's something that, it's not something to mess around with. You really need to be prepared adequately. And that's why we're talking about this now.
Yeah. And there's a lot of areas in the state that have just never been hit, or they haven't been hit in years. I remember when I said that.
Shouldn't have said that.
I know. But I remember
happened,
moving
though.
from South Florida, from
Right.
the Palm Beach area to the West Coast years ago, and buying houses, and we're asking, oh, do you have hurricane shutters? And people looked at you like you had 3 heads.
Yeah, right. You're
like
right.
a lot people didn't have, especially up in like the Clearwater area and whatnot, they didn't have, it's like, oh, we've never been hit by a hurricane. We don't know. We don't have any of that. But then Irma came along, and these storms, more and more storms are coming through the Gulf now. And I think people are starting to become more cognizant of that. But again, with a lot of new people, moving to the state and not having that experience, but yeah, Mother Nature's a scary thing. She can rear her ugly head, and we have no control over it. And like Chelsea said, a storm can be completely, headed towards one area, and then 2 hours before it can take a turn and end up in a completely different spot. And that original area doesn't even get any effects from it. So
well, that's what Charlie did in 04. And then 05, you're talking about late storms that come out of nowhere. Wilma was an October storm.
Yeah.
And then Michael, which I felt like formed within a day and became a Category 5, was also in October and decimated the Panhandle. So yeah, these things are happening more frequently. There's talk, I don't know if it's what the exact name of the entity or agency is. It's some national or global meteorological association is talking about starting hurricane season earlier next year, potentially May 15th, because every year we've had so many named storms prior to June 1st. We may actually see an earlier hurricane season, like a May 15th to November 30th, which nobody wants to hear that, but it's the reality of the activeness of the storm season. Just last year, we had so many named storms, they went into the Greek alphabet. So, I mean, it's, what's next? We have to be prepared for this, is going to be a thing that we're dealing with every year. We hope that we get a 12-year gap of no storms like we had from 04 to 2017 or whatever it was. But we can't guarantee that. It's just as it's a guessing game for anybody at this point, but we have to be ready.
Yeah. I used to joke that hurricane season really doesn't start until August for Florida, because we usually, for a long time, we wouldn't get much, as far as big storms until August, September. But like you said, that's changing, just like the course is changing more. We used to get a lot in the Southeast Florida, and now more and more are starting to come through the Gulf. So there's just no telling, But okay, so mistakes to avoid. We've got a few minutes here so let's talk about that, Chelsea.
Yeah, it's just, selecting low cost over quality work. We've had to come in behind a lot of other contractors that were trying to secure the job with the lowest estimate, but they also cut a lot of corners. So when you are getting, estimates for repair, make sure that you go through that estimate to make sure everything's included. Go through it with your adjuster, go through it with your insurance agent to make sure that everything is included in there, all the details, because what can happen is they'll either cut corners and you're going to have to repair it down the road, or, they're going to add on additional supplements throughout and could possibly end up being more expensive than the contractor that had everything in there in the first place. And then contractor scans, we definitely touched on this. There's a lot of fraud after storms. People, storm chasers, basically flying in from all over because they see a paycheck. So this goes back to vetting your restoration companies, any kind of vendor, just making sure that they have the insurance, they have the licenses, all of that, which should be part of your pre-planning process. And then, underestimating the time factor. Time is critical after a storm, especially with water damage. Water damage can turn into mold. You can get a lot of secondary damage if you don't have a quick response to what you're already facing. And then the damage testing. So, we do not perform, restoration companies should not perform their mold testing, because that's frowned upon. You can't test for mold, then repair it, and then test it again. It would just be okay every time. And asbestos. You cannot do any demolition without an asbestos report. So you can't begin cutting drywall. If you have an asbestos report, you need to keep that handy in a catastrophe situation.
Okay, great. And then I'm sure, Joe, you probably have some things, some pointers here, mistakes to avoid from an insurance standpoint. I'll lead you in. We had a question come in from one of our viewers here. They had I guess it was with Irma, they had a damage assessment from their carrier, and a preliminary check was sent. Later, an AOB was signed. Is it better to obtain an independent damage assessment and use that to file your actual claim?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And, I want to give too long-winded of an answer, but, the public adjusting firms are out there. They serve a purpose. Some would argue, or maybe many would argue, that it's been abused the past few years since Hurricane Irma. People were given 3 years to file a claim after any named storm. The prior law, I believe the current legislation that was just approved, made it now 2 years. So with that comes the ability of the insured, whether it's an association, to obviously file their claim through their insurance agent, work with their agent, and hopefully the agent has claims advocates and licensed claims adjusters in their own firm that help advocate on behalf of the insured to the insurance carrier to get the best outcome. Obviously, you want to be made whole to the greatest extent possible, less the deductible factor that's there. So that's the route that typically people go. But if there's unhappiness at the end of that process, and say the association believes that they're really due more, maybe they didn't get what they deserved and they're being told something different, there is a public adjusting route where you can get a public adjuster. And a lot of folks did that through assignment of benefits after Irma, and basically cut the insurance agent out of the process. We're no longer allowed to even communicate on your behalf as your insurance agent after a public adjuster is involved and there's an assignment of benefits. So that process, for a lot of associations, unfortunately, they started with that process as opposed to went through their insurance agent first. So they kind of jumped the gun. And the public adjusters are paid a percentage of the settlement. So there's an incentive for them to obviously try to get more. But it became a situation where, as the years progressed after Irma, there was so much, say, basically unscrupulousness going on in that realm, where a lot of these claims were closed out. Initially, a lot of associations had opened an Irma claim, closed it out, got a check, said they were happy. And then an adjuster came knocking on their door and said, "Hey, I think I can get you more. Did you have any window damage or roof damage?" No, that wasn't our damage. Why? I bet you I can do some testing to prove that we can maybe submit the claim, reopen it, and get you new windows and a new roof. That was going on a systemic basis in Florida, which is borderline fraud. And it gets into a situation where, you talk about some of the other micro issues affecting Florida, which is attorney's fees. And the attorneys were getting paid and still are getting paid. There's new legislation that's trying to reform some of that was just approved, hasn't been signed yet by the governor. They would get a paid contingency fee multiplier to take on these cases, to sue an insurance carrier. So the attorneys are very much incentivized to take on these cases and ride that out as long as they can, because they're going to get paid huge fees at the end of the process. So when you have that, attorneys knowing they're going to make a ton of money in fees, and the public adjusters knowing they're going to get a huge percentage of the settlement, what's sad about all that is that in some cases, yes, the insureds would get some money and maybe get a new roof or get some new windows. They would get a small fraction of what the total award was. Most of it would go to the general contractor, attorney, and public adjuster. Then the insured would get some of that. And that's what's been going on in Florida, which is really creating part of the hard market here, making it even worse because carriers don't know how to anticipate what's going to happen. And now associations that have done that process are now viewed very negatively from an underwriting standpoint. As an insurance company, if you look at it, an individual risk and say, wow, they got a public adjuster after Irma, and the prior insurance carrier had to spend $7 million in litigation costs to fight the claim. I don't want anything to do with that association as an insurance company. It's not going to be something I'm going to be competitive on at all. So it's really creating a lot of problems. But there was some reform legislation that was recently just enacted that will help a little bit. It's we don't know, the jury's still out there. It's got to be implemented. It's public policy. We'll see where it goes. But to answer the question, the public adjusting realm serves a purpose, but it should not be the first thing you go out of the gate and do after the storm. Never. You should go through the process with the insurance carrier, with your agent, and see, where the insurance carrier comes back. Now, the insurance carriers now are putting on endorsements to basically preclude you from going through that process. Now we're seeing a lot of policy forms come out on property policies where they're saying there's a assignment of benefits exclusion, that you can't even go through that process going forward because they've been burned so hard by that process. But I did mention it was going to be long-winded. I'll stop there. So I just wanted to, hopefully that answers part of the question.
Any other mistakes to avoid from an insurance standpoint, Joe?
Well, I mean, just not knowing what you should know. Basically, basic things. You know, a lot of folks take their insurance policies and they just shelve them onto a shelf, and it collects dust, and they have no idea what they're covered for, what they're not covered for. Basic things like that. Just really get to know your insurance policies. You know, you may even want to, if you've been in the same sort of, renewal process for a few years, you really need to sort of refresh that. I would highly recommend, just like any other discipline that you have, and you're partnering with any other vendors or management or your attorneys, your accountants, you should interview other professionals in that space every few years and get a sense of what's going on in the market, learn about service platforms, learn about coverages. You just don't know what you don't know, and nothing is good or bad except through a competitive comparison in some cases. And insurance is the most important thing you'll ever buy as a board, ever. There's no question about it. And to not understand how it will respond and what's behind it, what's covered, is not a good place to be in from a fiduciary responsibility standpoint as a board member. So that's the key thing that you should be focused on, to make sure you know what's there, what's covered, and what your responsibility is going to be as it relates to your deductible and self-insurance.
And Joe, I know you've mentioned it in the past at different roundtables, is not having your insurance renew in the middle of hurricane season.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can't believe I didn't mention that,
I
Laura.
know, it's always a good point.
Jeez. Okay. So that is a really good point that Laura brings up. So there's a couple of issues with that. Number one, so if your renewal is between, June 1st, not as concerning earlier in hurricane season, but it can be because we're seeing some earlier storms. Or let's say you're renewing in like August, September, like Shauna said, that's like the real hurricane season, which you could argue we get most of the stronger storms. Then if you're ever in that cone of probability, and most of the carriers will do what they call binding restriction. So your incumbent carrier, any carrier will say, we're not going to bind any new business. So if you're stuck with your incumbent carrier and you're in a binding restriction and you are about to move to a more competitive property carrier with better terms, rates, conditions, et cetera, you can't. You're stuck where you are with your current carrier. There's no way that you can move that. And then also, if you're in sort of the thick of hurricane season, you're going to have way less competitiveness in the marketplace when your renewal comes around. Very few carriers are going to want to jump in and provide a great competitive rate, great option in the middle of hurricane season. It's just very rare. The modeling is worse. So it's not something that, it's not a good place to be from that standpoint. And also, it can affect you if you have a calendar year hurricane deductible. You have to remember what that means is that the deductible resets on January 1st. So that could actually happen. You could have your deductible reset. You could get a hurricane happen in early season and then get another one, and then your deductible could apply twice in that case, as opposed to resetting on January 1st. So you don't want to have that happen either. You want to have that one deductible application, and then if you get two events without that in that policy term time, that you're going to be covered. So there's definitely some things to watch out for from that standpoint.
Yep. Yeah, great points and huge costs. You have questions?
Yeah, I have another question that came in. It's actually a great question because I think there definitely is some confusion about around this. I remember from my days of managing communities myself. Does an agent of record block other insurance agents from getting quotes? Can you explain how that works, Joe?
Yes. So when you're working with any agent, any larger agent that specializes in community associations, whether it's HOAs or condos, every single agent, we all go to almost exactly the same markets, overwhelmingly so. There's very little differentiation in carrier, maybe a few different carriers on some of the ancillary lines, but it's not a material difference. What you want to do as a board is you want to interview, if you're thinking about, hey, maybe we don't have the right agent, maybe we need to change, interview another agent or two, have them review your policies. It doesn't cost anything to do that. Sit down with that agent, have a conversation, listen to their findings and recommendations. And then as a board, make a decision to hire one agent to go to all of those markets. And that agent would be hired as your agent of record to get you all of the quotes that you need, because you don't want to silo that process. You want to choose one quarterback, one person that specializes in it, that you're comfortable with, choose that person to represent you to the marketplace, and they will leverage all of those carriers against one another and will create the best scenario for you and put you in the best position possible in terms of options. So to answer the question, yes, once you choose your agent of record and you designate one agent as your agent of record to represent the association of the marketplace, no other agent can go out to market and get quotes for you because the agent that you've already chosen has been chosen to do that for you. So if you have a situation where you want to make it a competitive scenario, I highly suggest you go through the broker selection process, interview other agents, and make your determination that way. It's no different than how you would hire your attorney, your CPA, your management company, anything like that. It's really something that you just want to thoroughly vet to see what are you getting from a service standpoint, knowledge standpoint, and how aggressive is the agent that you're partnering with. Those are the key differentiators between agents. Yeah,
and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, because really what it's about is that agent's going to look over everything that you have. They're going to, look over what the building consists of or your association consists of, and they'll be able to tell you. It's not about like going out to bid. It's about them telling you, okay, this is what's been missed, or this, is overinsured, right, or whatever. It's really about the knowledge, like you said, of the agents, not so much 100%. About the bid itself.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's three things. It's the agent's knowledge, their service, what they do, service platform, and how aggressive they are in the marketplace. Those are the three differentiators between agents. There's really nothing else there. We're all going to the same insurance carriers. There's no super secret special market that I'm going to access that, another agent that's comparable to us in size couldn't. It's all the same. We all go to exactly the same places. That's why you want to choose one to do the job and to do the job right. And if there's an issue, go through that interview process and talk to other brokers and make a decision who you want to partner with.
Yeah, and it's not just about saving money. It's also like, I know about missing things. I think, we found, and Joe, you may even have been a part of this. I think it was in Laura's territory where, the gates and everything weren't insured, and it was never insured by the prior agent. So it's not just about saving money, but it's also about things that you may be missing, or your current agent may be missing, that could be very costly when it comes down to it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's coverage is the first thing that we look at. We're way more concerned about that. I mean, obviously there's a rate analysis that's part of what we look at, but now that we're in a hard market, the fact of, most people are not seeing rate decreases right now. Most everybody's in that sort of difficult scenario. If you're a coastal property, you're older, maybe it's going to be a harder property rate, but that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed 50% rate increase. There's still, rate analysis that can be done. There's exclusions analysis. There's a lot of review that goes into it just to see, what's covered correctly, what's not. There might be exposures, deficiencies. You're right. We've seen situations where ancillary property isn't covered. I mean, we've seen, all sorts of wild exclusions that boards were unaware of. And it's an endless list of things that we've run into over the years.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, we're pretty much over time now, but thank you all so much. Laura, I don't know if you want to flip to the next slide that's kind of about the info. So Joe, Chelsea, you guys were fantastic, wealth of knowledge. Here's some of their contact info, our contact info, and then Laura and I will also be reaching out to all of those who attended and sending you guys via email Chelsea and Joe's info as well as the link to this presentation in case you guys want to share it with other board members, committee members, anything of that nature. So thank you guys so much for your time. We appreciate it, and hopefully everybody will be a little more prepared for hurricane season now that we're a month out.
Yep. All right, thank you, Shauna. Yeah, I would just say one last word. It's just don't wait too long. Listen to your local county authorities. Listen to what the weather channel's saying. If they're saying prepare, go ahead and have your maintenance guys get sandbags. Go ahead and ask residents if it's time to put up storm shutters. Encourage all of that. A lot of people worry about what the residents are going to say, and they don't think it's going to hit. We don't want the pushback. If the local county, where you live, they're stating this is what our recommendation is, go ahead and move forward.
And if the weather channel is in your city when this is happening, make sure you listen closely. What's the one guy on the weather channel? If you see him,
Cantori.
That's right. If you see him, you're in trouble because it's coming your way.
Exactly. All right, guys. Thank you for a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thanks, everyone.
afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.